Welcome to Calling All Stations, the Transport Podcast, and a very happy new year to all our listeners. I'm Christian Wolmar, an author and journalist who has specialised in transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we aim to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories and interviews from across the world of transport. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades covering policy developments in transport. So, what stories do we have today?
Well, first of all, Happy New Year to you, Christian, and likewise to all of our listeners. In this episode, we're going to have a very extensive examination of civil aviation safety in the light of an interesting positive report that was published during the last few days, but also two quite extraordinary incidents relating to civil aviation. Then you have an interview, Christian, with Edmund King, president of the AA, regarding the deployment rollout of electric vehicles on the roads in Great Britain, about which there's also been a lot of coverage and public interest at the beginning of 2024. We'll then turn our attention to the state of the bus industry in England and an exclusive report from the Daily Mirror that confirmed what many of us suspected, that there have been very severe cuts to the bus network, especially outside of London, over the last 13 years. And then finally, we'll provide a platform for you to make a few predictions about what might happen in transport in the coming year.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark. And let's go straight into what has actually caught the news a lot over the past few days. And the few days that we've had in the new year, there's been actually two really serious and worrying incidents that on two completely different airlines. A JL flight into Tokyo on the 2nd of January, and then 3 days later, an Alaskan Airlines flight out of Portland, Oregon. Very different incidents, but both kind of raise issues about air safety. And fortunately, all those on board the JL flight escaped, but there were 5 deaths of a little plane that was heading for earthquake rescue, which and the 5 occupants of that were killed. Well, so let's start with the Japanese airline flights, which a lot of people would have seen the spectacular footage of the plane burning out completely after it came into land, hit this other little plane, burst into flames, ran along the runway in flames. And remarkably, all 379 passengers and crew managed to get out safely. And so in some respects, this was amazingly good news. So it was very worrying that the plane burst into flames so easily. But the fact that the evacuation procedures were such that everybody got out safely is a testimony to improvements in air safety. I mean, I remember, for example, 30 years ago, there was a similar fire of a plane on the runway at Manchester Airport. And at the time, various mistakes were made, and there wasn't a quick enough response, and about half the people, I think around 40 or 50 people, actually perished as a result of that. And now we have, a much kind of, I think, more efficient way of evacuating people. There's been lessons learned from that. The insides of planes are less flammable, for example, and clearly there's been a lot of training about air safety and getting people out of difficult situations like that. So in a way, that's a testimony to the improvements there have been. With the Alaskan Airlines flight, again, there's some similarities with past incidents, which I'll refer to. But a door that was out of commission somehow flew off. And fortunately, the aircraft had only just taken off and therefore was not very high. But immediately the cabin depressurized and there were no serious incidents that nobody got sucked out. But what experts suggest is that had this been higher up, people might well have been sucked out of this door as the cabin depressurized. And indeed, this has similarities with an accident I recollect from Paris in 1974 when a DC-10, the cargo door, wasn't shut properly. And it took off, but it got quite high. And as a result, when the door flew off, the cabin depressurized very quickly. The floor collapsed, the crew lost control, and more than 300 people were killed in that incident. So the people on the Alaskan Airlines flight had a very lucky escape, and there were no injuries. But it must be said, these two incidents highlight the fact that aviation, is a perilous enterprise, and flying in the air in these rather fragile tubes is bound to have its risks. But what is remarkable is that the airline industry has become so much safer over the past 20, 30 years. I remember when I was transport correspondent at Independent in the 90s, I remember covering a report by Lufthansa at the time, which said that unless the rate of accidents per 1,000 or million flights started reducing, then there would be an accident within a few years, because the number of flights was increasing worldwide. There would be a major accident every couple of weeks. And the report basically said that that would become unacceptable to the public, and that therefore safety had to improve. And so it has. The rate of accidents has gone down from something like 4.5 accidents per, I think it's per 100 million flights, down to something like 1 or less than that.
Of course, Christian, you've been covering, as you say, airline safety for many years, and it's very interesting to hear your long-term perspective on all of this. But just in the last few days, we've had a really interesting report from Adrian Young, who works for the Dutch aviation consultancy TO70, that said some really remarkable things about improvements in civil aviation safety.
Yes, indeed. He basically said that 2023 was essentially the first year in which there had been no fatalities on international jet flights. There had been a couple of domestic accidents, I think in Nepal and Brazil, but still with just about 85 deaths or something like that. But therefore, this was the safest year ever for international aviation. And indeed, one does notice this, that there are actually very few accidents that all the major airlines, many of which did suffer at times from crashes. And indeed, I remember Qantas always boasted that it was the one that had never had a major accident out of all the major airlines. Now there's lots of airlines, including many of the low-cost airlines, that have never had a fatal accident. So that has improved, and it's improved actually through the learning experience in a similar way to how the railway safety has improved, because it's a classic thing of there's an accident and then you learn from that, and you learn the lessons. For example, you improve the flight crew training for incidents such as the fire in the plane in Tokyo, or you basically learn to improve the structure of the airlines. Of course, there's a couple of recent exceptions to that. Was when Boeing had a couple of crashes in its new 737 MAX aircraft, two terrible disasters, which were then put down to the fact that it had made changes to software that was not properly understood by the pilots, hadn't been properly explained to them, and resulted in, I think, something like over 300 deaths in the combination of the two accidents. And indeed, the Max aircraft, which was the same one involved in the Alaskan Airlines incident, the Max 737, which was an updated version of the old 737, which has been around for 50 years. And that resulted in their planes, the new version of the plane, being grounded for 20 months. And of course, the last thing they want is a repeat of that. But it has actually, the Alaskan Alaskan Airlines incident has actually resulted in this fleet being grounded in America, and I think elsewhere as well. So, and again, that's because the lessons have to be learned from this before there's a tragedy.
But of course, what you suggest, and going back to your Lufthansa example from all those years ago, is that these kind of overall improvements in safety are derived from people working really hard to achieve those outcomes. They don't happen by chance or simply as a result of technological progress. You have to have a strategy in place and a relentless program of learning.
Absolutely. And actually, Mark, you also have to have regulation and tight regulations. And one of the things that emerged in the aftermath of the two Max disasters from Boeing is that there hadn't been sufficiently tight regulation on the introduction of new types of software, and there was a measure of self-regulation, and that was very much highlighted in the post-accident reports into it, and there have been changes as a result of that. So yes, it's all about a relentless effort by lots of people in the industry, but also with the backing of regulation and the readiness of the aviation authorities to impose regulation.
And of course, one of the lessons from the Tokyo Haneda incident on the 2nd of January is if you are traveling by civil aircraft, do pay attention to those safety briefings. Take your nose out of your book or newspaper or whatever and pay attention, because it just might save your life.
Absolutely. And I must say, I'm slightly remiss about that. And the next time I go on a flight, I'll make sure I do look at the safety instructions and the demonstration and make sure that I know where the nearest exit is.
With lots of news this week about the introduction of electric vehicles on roads in Great Britain, you've been catching up with one of the experts on this matter, Christian.
Yes, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of bring people up to date about electric vehicles, because there is an awful lot of hype about it. But as you will hear from this interview with Edmund King, who's the president of the AAA, there's also been a lot of developments, and there is progress towards this target of essentially phasing out fossil fuel cars by almost the middle of the century, 2040. So it makes for a very interesting listen. There's been a lot of talk about electric vehicles lately, about the fact that there might not be enough charging points, about the fact that Rishi Sunak has somewhat delayed targets for their implementation and so on. And we thought we'd catch up on the issue with the best person to talk about it, which is Edmund King, the president of the AA, who tells me he's been their president for the last 16 years. He was at the RAC before that. And what he doesn't know about cars and motoring, I think you could write on a very small piece of paper. So, Edmund, welcome to Calling All Stations. And I did think you were the right person to bring us up to date with what's happening in electric vehicles. I mean, what's the overall situation, right? You know, where are we at in this kind of great transformation from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles?
Well, first, Christian, thank you for welcoming me onto your podcast, Calling All Stations. I think the electric vehicles, it's an incredibly exciting period. And I think we need a bit of context here, because the combustion engine car hasn't changed much for over 100 years. You know, if you actually think about it, back to the Model T Ford, 4 wheels, steering wheel, combustion engine, And indeed, there were some electric vehicles back 100 years ago as well.
I often say this, Edmund, yeah, the car is still the car. I say that about trains as well. The trains are still trains. They run on metal rails and so on.
Absolutely. But I think with electric vehicles, what I've seen, what has changed. I had my first one. You'll probably remember it was about 20 years ago. In fact, they were launched in London by the then mayor Ken Livingstone, and I had one for 6 months. It was a Ford Think car. It was a kind of polyurethane type small city car that only had a range of about 30 miles. It was incredibly slow. And indeed, one fateful Friday, when I somewhat foolishly decided to drive it from central London to St Albans, I got to Radlett and run out of charge because I hadn't worked out it was raining and that my windscreen wipers would use more of the battery. Now, when I think back 20 years to the Ford Think car, and then I think to the electric cars that are on the market today, and in fact, that I drive today, things have come on in leaps and bounds. You know, that you have got attractive, you have got technologically advanced vehicles that are really good to drive, that have much better ranges. So in terms of that kind of picture on the automotive market, things have changed from the better. You know, I will admit it, you know, I was brought up with cars. I lived next door but one to Colin Chapman, the founder of Lotus Cars, when I was a kid. And that gave me quite a passion.
In Norfolk.
Yeah, in Norwich, yeah.
Yeah.
And that gave me quite a passion for cars. And Chapman flew me, actually, to my first Grand Prix as a kid. And I met Graham Hill and Emerson Fittipaldi and all of those. So, you know, I did grow up with cars. I've worked in automotive of one sort or another for most of my life. And I would say some 7 or 8 years ago, I was fairly pessimistic about the future because the early electric vehicles were functional, but not really exciting, not good to drive. You know, you really did need to be a bit of an anorak to really embrace them. But what we're seeing now is some of the best cars are electric cars. So, you know, some of the best cars overall are electric cars.
But best in terms of what? In terms of comfort, in terms of
comfort,
speed,
joy of driving, excitement, functionality. They are quiet, they're technologically advanced, they are safe. So in terms of that, I'm encouraged that you know, we're not downgrading, if you like, but it is radically different, and you know, it's different the way we fuel them. Although there are still lots of myths about electric cars, and obviously we kind of know quite a lot about these myths because we attend about 9,000 breakdowns every day. And those include electric vehicles. And what's really interesting, Christian, is that the top 30% of breakdowns for electric vehicles are exactly the same as those for petrol or diesel vehicles.
Oh, really? I thought they'd be running out of charge, that most of them have run out of charge.
Exactly. That is the myth. So the top 30% of breakdowns.
Oh, right. Fascinating.
Oh, totally.
Oh, really?
Totally. So the top 30% are tires and wheels and 12-volt battery. And that is the same for electric vehicles as with petrol vehicles or diesel vehicles. Now, with running out of charge, we've got the latest figures on that. About 5 years ago, 8% of the breakdowns of electric vehicles was out of charge. 2 years ago, it was 4%. Last year, it was 2.3%. So it is a tiny proportion that are out of charge. And of those 2.3% last year, half of those weren't actually out of charge. They were low on charge. And the driver was worried, so they contacted us. So, you know, this kind of talk about range anxiety, and you read articles in the press about, I did a journey to the West Country and couldn't make it.
Yeah.
Frankly, is nonsense. I mean, I've driven John O'Groats to Land's End in an EV. I've driven another one from Cardiff to Bristol to London to Edinburgh to Belfast to Dublin. And I charged in all of those places. I didn't have to wait to charge. I think apart from one or two occasions, I had to wait. So,
but how long
I've
does it
got
take you
to
to charge? How long does it take you to charge each time over those sort of distances?
next to nothing. So in a modern EV, if you are between 20% charge and 80% charge, and the advice is to only charge up to 80%. It's a bit like a phone battery. You preserve it better. If you don't go under 20%, you don't go over 80%. Right. So if you're within that, and I did it last week, coming back from Bristol, I stopped at Lee Delamere services on the M4. I had about 25% charge. I plugged in, went for a coffee, went for a sandwich. 20 minutes later, when I came back to the car, I was at 80%. So I needed a break anyway. The advice we give at the AA anyway is that you should stop off every 2 hours or so, have a coffee, walk around, wake yourself up. So as long as there are chargers there and they're available, the time spent actually charging is fine on motorway service areas. The majority of people charge at home if they can, and I do accept there are about 40% of households haven't got off-street parking, and I think that is more problematic, because in my case, I would say 98% of the time I charge at home. It's only if I'm going to Norwich and back to watch the Canaries, I can actually get there on one charge, but I normally get a boost halfway just to remove any kind of range anxiety, and in case the road was closed and I had to be diverted and all of that. But the majority of cases, if you've got off-street parking, it is easy to charge at home. And also it's much cheaper. You only pay 5% VAT on your electricity at home. If you've got a tariff that you can charge between midnight and 5 in the morning, it is only about 9p a kilowatt, which compared to
how much a kilowatt? I missed that. How much a kilowatt?
Yeah, about 9p at the lowest period. Whereas if you're on a motorway service area with a rapid charger, it can be as high as about 82p. So there's massive difference. So if you can charge at home, it is much more affordable and so much cheaper than a petrol or diesel car. I mean, honestly, because I've been driving electric cars for so long, when I go past a petrol station and I look at the costs of fuel, it really frightens me, because I no longer go to petrol station. Once you've made that initial purchase, and I do accept generally electric vehicles are more expensive to buy, and unless you're lucky enough to have a company car or salary sacrifice where you get big tax breaks. But once you've got the car, the actual running costs are much cheaper.
Okay, so you've sold us the idea of electric vehicles, but has the government bought that idea? Because they've slowed down the targets to take them up, and will we actually get to this situation by 2040 when we won't be having very many fossil fuel cars at all?
Yeah, I mean, the government's position is really quite interesting when you dissect it, because obviously originally the target was petrol and diesel cars, new ones, would be phased out in 2030. The government then did a U-turn on that last year and changed it from 2030 to 2035 because they thought that would be more popular. The irony is, though, Christian, underneath those targets is something that is called the Zero Emission Vehicle Mandate. And that hasn't changed. And that is actually quite radical. What that says is this year, for manufacturers, 22% of the cars they sell should be zero emission. And
Right.
if they don't meet those targets, for every car beyond that, they would have to pay something like £15,000. Now, that zero emission mandate hasn't changed, and it means by 2030, 80% of a manufacturer's cars have to be zero emission. So even though they changed that headline figure to help drivers from 2030 to 2035, the mandate below it, which mandates manufacturers, hasn't changed at all. So, we still have pretty radical targets compared to the rest of Europe, or indeed the rest of the world.
Are we doing better than the rest of Europe?
Yeah, it does vary. There are some countries that are markedly better, like Norway, because Norway had such big incentives. It was almost everyone in Norway had a Tesla. You could get 60% off.
Right.
They've slowed that down now, but it did give them a massive lead. Amongst the other countries, we are actually doing quite well. But the interesting thing that you initially asked about, and I've kind of gone off a bit of a tangent, and I apologize, is are there enough chargers out there? And I think, again, this gets somewhat confusing because people talk about this government target of 300,000 chargers by the end of the decade. And yes, some minister did say that. But, the government didn't provide us with petrol stations. They didn't go out and do it. The first petrol station in the UK was provided by the Automobile Association at Aldermaston. Yeah. And I've heard government ministers actually refer to that. And again, with electric chargers, the government are not providing the majority of chargers. I mean, the majority of chargers on the public highway are still done by private companies investing in that infrastructure. Yes, there are grants for local authorities for some local chargers, for some on-street chargers, some of the lamppost chargers and things like that will be vital for those people without off-street parking. But the government's saying 300,000. Well, that's a kind of notional figure. They are not going to provide them. I do think there is a role for government, though, in filling in the gaps, because if you look at the map of Britain, some areas do have more chargers per head or per car than other areas. London, the southeast is
it's a lot better
good.
than the northeast. Yeah, northeast are pretty bad. Yeah,
absolutely. Whereas parts of Scotland are really, really good, and Scotland took a lead on us by providing free charges about 6 or 7 years ago. Yes, there are some gaps. So there are some roles for government and local authority, particularly to help fill in those gaps. But the market will decide on the vast majority of charges. You've got companies like GridServe, like Instavolt, who are investing billions of pounds in charging infrastructure. And you've got some big electric charge forecourts, big one at Braintree in Essex, big one in Norwich, where you've got 30, 40 chargers, big investments.
But is there not a danger that you'll end up with areas where you just can't have an electric vehicle?
I'm not sure that is the case, because in most rural areas, you would have enough land or off-street parking to put in your own charger.
Right.
And as most cars now have a range of 200 to 300 miles, if you think about it, even if you lived, in deepest Lancashire or deepest North Wales, if you could charge it at home and you've got a range of 200 miles, then actually you are okay. So again, it's getting over some of these myths. The one problem though I do foresee here, Kristen, is when we turn up on a Sunday night at a motorway service area, and it is getting better. You are getting more charges there. There are still, I think, about 4 of the motorway service areas that haven't got any charges at all. So that needs to be improved. Right. But when you turn up now and say there are 8 charges, and 5 of them are occupied, and then you see another 3 EVs come in, and you have to wait. The way I look at that at the moment, it's just about okay. You can do it on most journeys, and with a bit of planning, you should never, wait till you've only got 10% charge. I will always charge before then, so I'll stop before I have to. But the thing that does get me when I look around at these massive service areas, and I think only 3% of cars on the road are EVs today. And then when I look ahead and think, well, what when it's 15%? What when it's 20%? What when it's 50%? How many more chargers will we need? And I think that is still a bit of a daunting picture.
So how do you plan for this? How do you solve that if it's mainly the private sector doing it? How do you deal with that?
Well, that is one of the things that the government have started to try and address by freeing up some of the planning laws, whereby the connections to the grid can be made sooner without all that bureaucracy. Because one of the problems was getting those connections in, and if you like, future-proofing those connections, knowing that in 5 years' time you'll need to double the number of chargers. So it is quite a massive infrastructure project, and national highways have a policy for this, alongside the private sector. So that is my one area where, I am concerned when I look to the future. Currently today you can get by despite what some articles say.
So what obviously we may, certainly I hope we will have a Labour government at some point this year. Are you advising them to do anything? Is there something that they really need to deal with in relation to this?
Yeah, I mean, the things we've basically said to Labour, as we've said to all parties, it really is down to freeing up that planning process, speeding up that planning process, so that those companies that are there to invest can invest and aren't thwarted by the kind of bureaucracy of planning. And I think that is the number one thing. The government itself, whichever government, cannot afford themselves to put thousands of chargers across the country. They cannot afford to do that. They didn't do it with petrol stations. They shouldn't have to do it. It shouldn't be a government thing. But they do need to free up the way for the private sector to deliver, and they do need to fill in the gaps, which some local authorities are.
Okay.
So, we're not there yet, but, we are on the road to that zero emission future.
And then just to end on, then there is the big side issue, Edmund, which is quite an electric vehicle issue. But when you do get to 10 or 15 or 20% and petrol sales start to plummet, diesel sales start to plummet, and that wonderful tax take gets used, what do you then envisage that you'll just have to tax electric cars, or what do you think is going to happen as a result of that?
Yeah, this is the perennial question, because as you know, the government takes about £30 billion in tax from drivers, and all the graphs show that will drop off quite considerably. I mean, it was interesting a few years ago for the Wolfston Economics Prize, the question was, how do you address and pay for the future of motoring, when you haven't got this taxation? And I did a submission, in fact, with my wife, Deirdre, who's an economist, and we talked about road miles. So what our concept was, it's akin to road pricing, but you and I know you will never sell road pricing as such. It's always 10 years away. It's always politically impossible. You and I were there when Alistair Darling put his proposals out, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So
no, I was there when McGregor flew us across to Oslo and Gothenburg and to look at the road pricing things they were doing then, and that was 1993 or 4 or something.
Absolutely. Yes. And it was 10 years away then, and it's still 10 years away. So what we proposed in road miles is that to sell it to the public, every member of the public would get 3,000 miles free, and then after that you would pay per mile. But if you lived in a rural area, you'd get a third more. If you were a disabled driver, you'd get more. But it was just a way of packaging it to make it more saleable to the public. And then you could transfer your road miles if you weren't using them. You could sell them. It becomes a currency. Well, we were runners-up in the Wolfson Economics Prize. Unfortunately, we didn't win the 250,000 prize, but we did win 10 grand. But
wow, that's a great idea. That's a great idea, Edmund. And I think we'll promote that as calling all stations, because I think that's a very workable idea and quite equitable, because people use up the 3,000 miles. It still might be an issue in rural areas and so on. You might have to think, well, maybe if you live in a very rural area, you get 5,000 to start with.
No, we did that. We offered a third more, so we did cover that off. So I think at some stage that will have to come. But currently, both the current government and opposition parties are far too nervous to talk about it at the moment. They won't touch it. So I still think it will probably be 5-6 years at least off, and then it will take the courage of someone like Ken Livingstone, who, when he came into London and as mayor at the beginning of the process, introduced congestion charging, didn't wait for an election towards the end. He did it straight away and did it. And I think
nobody thinks about it anymore. Nobody thinks about it. It's not even when they were making all that fuss about ULEZ, which we won't go into, but nobody was then saying, oh God, what about the outrage of the congestion charge? So no, well, thank you, Edmund. That's a great kind of run around the houses in an electric vehicle, and enjoy your trips to my rivals, Norwich, because I'm a Queen's Park Rangers supporter.
Indeed.
Thanks. Cheers.
Thanks very much.
The Daily Mirror had a New Year's Day exclusive stating that bus services are in crisis as the miles driven have plummeted by a quarter since the present UK government won power, saying that according to official figures, buses in England drove 300 million fewer miles in the last year than in 2010, a massive fall of over 22%, despite being the most popular form of transport. How do you react to that, Christian?
Well, it is the most well-used part of public transport. And of course, that is dominated by London and a couple of other cities, but London in particular, where just, everybody uses buses. But, outside of the few big conurbations, really, you just can't get a bus. And so, the government has tried, to be fair to the Conservative government, they've tried by having this £2 maximum fare. They've renewed that. But as has been pointed out, there's no point having a £2 fare if there's no bus. And that really is the case for large swathes of the country. And it's been a slow but long-term decline, really, ever since the industry was privatized in the mid-1980s and subsidies were removed from local authorities, and local authorities now often have to choose between, do you keep the local swimming pool open or do you run the bus service, and so on. And those cuts are continuing. As you probably know, there's about 30 local authorities that may go bankrupt this year. So they're not going to kind of increase their support for bus services, which is something that doesn't quite show up as much as closing a swimming pool or a library or really squeezing social services. So this is going to continue unless there is essentially money, but also maybe the freedom for local authorities to run services. And that, again, is something the government has done. They've restored the right in Manchester to franchise out the services, and there's other councils that are going to try and follow that route. But, and I think this is a big but, will they have the money to do it? I mean, it's no good just giving local authorities the right to run services if they can't afford to run them. Now, I don't think one should be romantic about this. I mean, I think, that report of the Daily Mirror highlights the fact, well, there's many villages that, don't have a bus service at all. And frankly, I can't see that being restored in a lot of places. I mean, really, if you've got a village of kind of 100 people and, most of them have cars and whatever, you're probably never going to get a bus service back. But there's an awful lot of towns, suburbs in towns, small towns, larger villages where there's absolutely no service to the local big town or conurbation or whatever. And I think there should be, and the Labour Party should look at this if it comes to power, there should be a system like there is in Switzerland, where if you're a town or village of a certain amount of people, you absolutely have to have a bus service to the nearest big town. And if you're a town of a certain size, you have to have a certain number of buses running to the major town every day, or to the suburbs every day, and so on. And actually having a coherent strategy towards restoring bus services, even if it takes 5 or 10 years, at least with a strategy there, people would be able to hope that there will be some restoration of bus services. But at the moment, as the Daily Mirror emphasizes, it is in crisis.
And of course, as well as the routes themselves, it's the hours of coverage, isn't it? You there in London are used to buses running from pretty much 5 o'clock in the morning till 1 o'clock in the morning, where there's in so many medium-sized towns and cities across Great Britain, you might be able to get the bus for one leg of the journey, but you can't actually get the bus back after the trip to the restaurant or the pub or the cinema, because the service has stopped running in the evening.
Absolutely, and that makes them not so useful, so that people end up with cars. Look, in London, it's even better than that. We have night services on a lot of routes, and you can get home, and we even have the underground running at night on some lines, and there's even now a London Overground is running a night service. So on some days, not every day, but nevertheless, so it is really a tale of two completely different systems, with London being the beneficiary of a service that people can only dream of outside. And maybe that's an ambition, again, that the politicians could have, is to try to offer. And I have heard Andy Burnham say this, we need London type services, and then we would not have so many cars on our roads. So there's a lot of work to be done there.
Here's Christian's final thought from the Departure Lounge.
Well, I thought I'd take advantage and offer the listeners a few mystic Wolmar kind of predictions for the year. And I've been doing this in Rail Magazine for many years, and I normally get it wrong. So, but here goes anyway. So the first one, I think, which is very basic, is a political one. I think Keir Starmer will win the election. Labour will have a healthy majority, and then we'll have to cope with all sorts of difficulties. But, we wish them good luck. The second one thing is that the election, I don't think, will take place till towards the end of the year, as Rishi Sunak has just hinted, although he hasn't actually committed himself to that, but he's hinted that. So the Tories are going to have to publish their draft rail reform bill, and that will make interesting reading, because they have to make some hard decisions on it. I think you might recollect in one of our earlier podcasts, we discussed the point, and even quoted that Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, actually said, well, there's still some issues to sort out about how much power we want to give this new Great British Railways organisation and so on. So they're going to have to show their hand, and that will be interesting. And I suspect, actually, that they're going to leave quite a lot of power with the Department for Transport and not kind of hand over everything to Great British Railways. But we'll see about that. Then my favourite subject, as you know, autonomous vehicles, about which I've written a book and which I kind of follow very assiduously. And Cruise, there are two big players basically in the United States, Cruise and Waymo. And Cruise has got into great trouble because of an accident where a woman was hit by a conventional car, knocked into the path of a Cruise car, and the car then actually ran her over again, causing her with terrible injuries. So they've now withdrawn all their cars. And I suspect that Waymo, which is actually Google, Alphabet, as the parent company is called, is actually going to also get into trouble and may well kind of begin to retrench. And that's my prediction. I'm sticking my neck out on that one. And finally, I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure for legislation on dockless bike hires. Now, in London, there are many bikes coming, mainly Lime and Human Forest, a couple of other companies. You're seeing increasing numbers of these bikes, which are now mostly or nearly all electric bikes, unlike the docked bikes, the Santander bikes, which are not electric. And they're very popular, they're quite expensive, but there is no clear kind of legislation and rules about these. And so companies are setting up, they're kind of leaving their bikes kind of lying around everywhere. It's all a bit chaotic. And I suspect there will be big pressure to begin to sort that out, along with e-scooters, which also need sorted out. So those are my predictions.
Calling All Stations, the transport podcast with Christian Wolmar, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.